welcome everyone to our session today on natural capital and livelihoods. I'll be moderating this session, and during this panel, we're going to have a conversation about how communities, supply chains, and supporting actors can rebuild the blue and green economies that have been impacted by the pandemic. Specifically, we're going to talk about how we can rebuild economies with a focus on regeneration, transformation, and sustainability. And joining us on the panel are three individuals who work at the intersection of natural resource markets and livelihood development. I'll give a brief introduction to each of them, and then we can dive into our questions. So Dav, Ninka, and Diego, if you can turn on your videos as I introduce you. So Dav Rosenman is the head of country for Earthworm Foundation in Brazil. Dav comes to us with 19 years of professional experience in international development. He's been contributing with Earthworm as country head in Brazil since 2019 and brings a background in social and environmental transformation. In Brazil, the Earthworm team has been supporting companies and communities to build dialogue and practical solutions to address issues of climate change, regeneration, and livelihoods. With his consolidated knowledge in strategic planning process management, business modeling, theory of change, and innovation, Dav has been providing facilitation and support to organizations such as Nestle, Cargill, Natura, and Lavazza. So we're happy to have you on the panel, Dav, and look forward to the conversation. Ninka Stam is the Program Director of Landscape Finance at IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative. She also directs the IDH Liberia Landscapes Program. Ninka mobilizes, in her role as Director of Landscape Finance, mobilizes inclusive investment in sustainable production and restoration and protection of natural resources in IDH's focused landscapes, while also managing technical assistance facilities for sustainable land management funds, such as the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund, the Ann Green Fund, and the Agri3 Fund. She also manages IDH's landscape program in Liberia and has worked in IDH's tropical timber program as well. Prior to joining IDH in 2014, Ninka was employed as team leader on green growth with Include, and before that, she worked in the private sector with international companies in agriculture and clean energy supply chains. So happy to have you on the panel, Ninka. And then lastly, we have Diego Unduruga from Future of Fish as a director of Future of Fish's Chile program. Diego is an industrial and systems engineer and has a master's degree in environmental science and management from the Bren School at the University of California, Santa Barbara, with a specialization in coastal marine resources. As a Latin American fisheries fellow at the Bren School, Diego focused on the development of market-driven solutions for fisheries sustainability. And during his time in California, he also collaborated with the Environmental Markets Lab and other research groups on projects ranging from human rights abuses on fisheries on a global scale to the socio-ecological adaptive capacity to climate change for small-scale fishing communities in Chile and Mexico. With the focus in natural resources management in Chile, Diego has worked in both the public and private sectors. As a director of Future of Fish's Chilean operations, Diego works today with local fishers and mid-level supply chain players to implement technology and practice changes that are part of a global systemic initiative to drive down global overfishing. So Diego, happy to have you on the panel as well. And lastly, as your moderator, I'd be remiss not to actually introduce myself as well. My name's Ethan Miller. I'm a senior analyst at Resonance with our natural resources management team, where I manage, implement, and develop market-based approaches and public-private partnerships for natural resource sustainability in emerging markets. Resonance's natural resource work covers a variety of sectors and geographies, but my focus is on implementing projects on forestry, conservation, and fisheries in Central Africa and Southeast Asia. So I'm excited to moderate this panel and learn from the experiences of our panelists here with us today. So To begin, we're going to start this conversation first talking about the impacts and the challenges posed by the pandemic in the context, supply chains, and countries in which our panelists have worked. After a few minutes of conversation, we'll then look to the solutions and look towards how we can rebuild economies coming out of the pandemic and moving towards a future of regeneration and transformation. So our first question will go to Ninka. Ninka, you manage IDH's landscape program in Liberia, which covers a number of agriculture supply chains and the communities who interact with those supply chains. How have you seen the pandemic impact the supply chains and context with which you work?
Thanks, Ethan. And yeah, very happy to be on this panel today with you and with the other participants, of course. Yeah, maybe to respond to this question on how the pandemic impacts supply chains and the context in Liberia. Maybe to start, like IDH has been working in Liberia since 2015, and we have what we call a landscape approach, which basically means that we try to work on sustainability issues in the commodity production space, so production of cocoa, production of palm oil, through our what we call PPI approach, which is based on production, but also protection of natural resources and inclusion of local communities and smallholders in these global supply chains. So maybe that just to set a bit of context. And Liberia is also quite a unique country in the sense that it is host to the last large tropical rainforests of West Africa and its related biodiversity. Now, maybe looking at the impacts of COVID-19, to be honest, our plans for 2020 as an organization were not that hugely affected. So what were the impacts of COVID in Liberia? And maybe just, I don't want to downplay the social and the health impacts. Of course, people were very worried when this pandemic started, also considering the very poor infrastructure and health infrastructure in this country. And also, of course, very many people in Liberia and Sierra Leone had very fresh memories of the Ebola crisis that was there only maybe 8 years before. But I, before this conference, also looked up the numbers. And in terms of registered cases, there were 6,000 cases in total and less than 300 deaths. So in terms of impact, that is compared to other locations quite limited. I think the main impacts of COVID have been related to operational and logistics issues. And of course, in the supply chain space to spikes and hiccups in commodity prices. So COVID-19 came, of course, with a lot of restrictions, and that has disrupted operations. And it's also changed consumption patterns in many locations, especially at first. So initially, commodity prices dropped. People were not able to sell. People were not able to get goods out of the country. So that's where communities, of course, got affected. But most of these supply chains got themselves organized. Most of the prices bounced back. So if I look at it in hindsight, I think what COVID did, especially in 2020, is really expose the vulnerability of the global supply chain and of the food system. And especially in regions and locations in Liberia that rely very much on global commodity markets for people's income, that of course caused immediate income and food shortages challenges. Now, was that new for Liberia, these type of disruptions? I would almost say not really, because it is a country, of course, that is used to unpredictability and to disruption. It's a country with poor infrastructure, so these regions previously had faced situations where rice would not be able to be tracked in because bridges would have collapsed, or there have been roads or other type of infrastructural challenges. So was that new for a country like Liberia? Maybe not so much, but does it underscore the importance of diversified production systems and of resilience and of food security and income diversification within these regions that so much focus on commodity production? Yes, I think that has again been reconfirmed. So yeah, as said, fortunately, from our perspective, operations were not very much affected, although of course it was more difficult to organize meetings in communities and these type of things, but also considering the experiences that were already there around Ebola, setting up hand washing stations, setting up like basic health precaution measures, those were very quickly introduced. And if I look back now on the past 2 years, I think our program has still been able to make very good progress. What we've been focusing our work on in Liberia is on securing community land rights. So there we have supported close to 1 million hectares of land to now become under formal community ownership and title deeds. And working with these communities to develop land use plans where they target specific areas of land for agricultural production and setting aside other areas, forests, riparian buffer zones for long-term conservation. And then we also were able to still continue our work on food security and income diversification, which I think many other organizations also work on. Small-scale conservation agriculture, cassava processing, supporting village saving and loan associations. And I think that the pandemic did underscore the importance of these type of food security and income diversification activities in these type of vulnerable countries.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, thanks for highlighting that, Nika. And it sounds like, yeah, exposing existing vulnerabilities and emphasizing the need for food security, income diversification, connected supply chains, property ownership is all really important. So I appreciate that. I'm going to next ask Diego you a question, but before I do that, I want to emphasize to our participants that we will have some time to answer audience questions toward the end of the session. You can submit questions via the Q&A function in the Whova app. So please go ahead and do that. So Diego, question for you. We know Future of Fish works with hake fisheries in Chile, which is a frequently opaque supply chain characterized by the presence of many middlemen. So want to hear from you in 3 to 4 minutes how the pandemic impacted the domestic hake supply chain and also Future of Fish's work with those associated communities.
Excellent. Thanks, Ethan, and thanks for the opportunity of talking a little bit about our work and our experience and our perspective here. Yeah, as a little bit of additional context, we work specifically with the small-scale fishers here who sail mainly in domestic markets, so that's important to keep in mind for my answer, and which is a sector that is in general dominated by informality. And then depending on the fishery, there can be significant levels of illegal, underreported, and unregulated fishing. So yeah, the pandemic struck, and initially the impact was significant, or the first couple of weeks or the first couple of months, especially, there was a lot of uncertainty. So everybody was like in full lockdown, and everybody was afraid, of course, as everywhere in the world, I presume. To go out and like do common like outdoor activities like such as gathering in the dock to go out fishing, and things like that. Initially, the whole country went to a lockdown. There was definitely important disruption of international supply chains, which affected for a longer period of time certain specific fisheries. But as I was saying, most of the fishers, most of the fisheries around the small-scale sector in Chile are more for domestic supply chains, which didn't have such a huge impact. Similar as what Nina was saying, like yeah, impact lasted a little bit at the beginning, but things then kind of adapted to a new reality. Our work was made like harder for sure because we were not able to go to the communities and work with the fishers, which is the core of what we do, right? Yeah, at the beginning, people stopped fishing for a while. Intermediaries stopped showing up. Traditional retailers, traditional sources of where fish is sold was disrupted. But then, for example, open air markets were never closed. And then fishers were defined by the government as essential workers, right? So again, like after a month or two, like things start kind of like coming back to normal. It was interesting, the government did try to support some basic platforms for direct commercialization of fishers, especially at the beginning. And some fishers started selling directly to consumers, which was super interesting to see as well. Some new supply chains were created, mainly from new online sales and delivery system, which of course exploded. It was something that was happening for a while, but then with the pandemic, people want like staying at home and everything, like all deliveries and like new systems started appearing, which was great because it was kind of like diversify the traditional, like, just the retail or just like the big players. And that was great as well because it allowed to kind of like create like these new narratives, and sometimes like even connect to like responsible fishing and responsible fishing practices and a bit. But that's something that I'm gonna probably talk about later a little bit more. So things, as I was saying, things have come back to normal a lot, but online sales has grown and will probably stay this way. And online sales have caught the attention of some fishers for sure. These new alternative channels, and this new possibility to create differentiated supply chains and narratives from small scale source, low impact, traceable, local, which today doesn't exist in the country, and that's also a super important point. The importance of like being able to have a differentiated market today. Like most fish in Chile are super commoditized. You don't know where it's coming from. It's industrial, artisanal, Chilean, aquaculture or not. So that's a super important first step. So yeah, I think the pandemic highlighted the importance of short supply chains, the possibility and rise of digital marketplaces for both fishers and intermediaries, and the importance of technologies for sure. As I said before, it's something that was happening, but grew very fast the last 1.5 years.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Diego. So now, Dav, over to you. Earthworm Foundation is implementing agroforestry, regenerative agriculture in Brazil. And as any implementers anywhere are aware, it matters just as much sort of who is involved in restoration and regeneration as the techniques, the science, the technical aspects used. So want to hear a bit more about, in your work, in Earthworm's work, how did you see the pandemic impact communities and stakeholders that you work with? Particularly interested in indigenous communities in Brazil that Earthworm works with.
Well, here you are, I'm sure, aware the drive of the pandemic have been everything but catastrophic, right? So we're talking about more than 24 million people that have been contaminated, and that's the official figure. So people are just tested when they are sick, and we're talking about more than 600,000 people that died from pandemic in Brazil. So everywhere you go, there is a sense of grieving. People are grieving, and that created massive disruption into the entire society. I can tell you that it's still a bit hard to assess the impact of what happened. We go to the field back last month, and yes, many things changed. Give you some example of that. Of course, we were in a very specific conditions, because you can say, oh, pandemic in a normal state of pressure and temperature, and pandemic under a negationist regime. So that's quite different. But we had massive impact at family level, just by the fact that the kids are out of the school for more than 2 years, perhaps. So what does it mean for mothers? even in rural communities. What does it mean when the price of energy is increased by more than 50%? When you need to run some machineries, you need to run any business, the price is growing up, and that will put the people that had been already, I will say, excluded or that are already vulnerable in a very stressful position because they have much less resilience. So I would say that the COVID crisis really stressed this factor of community level of resilience. If it's about economy, if it's about food security, is it about land rights, all the resilience had been put at challenge. And we can see some migration going on also in communities. So people that were normally living in cities that are going back to their original family origin because they cannot sustain themselves in city anymore. So I will say that we've been plunged by poverty and it's accelerating. The recovering process from pandemic as a society is not there. And it's really affecting the rural communities in Amazon more specifically. So when you take the filter of indigenous communities, then it's really catastrophic situation because COVID was a distraction factor of the public agenda. So having the COVID crisis had been a very good excuse for certain agenda, political agenda in the Congress to rule about indigenous rights and reservation, to rule about certain type of activities such as informal gold mining or native timber commerce. And during all the pandemic, we saw a lot of crises bubbling on the country, affecting directly indigenous communities. And that drove to one case that is under analysis at IA International Crime Court, analyzing the Brazilian government for genocide. It's under study. So it's just really serious what I'm talking about. We're not talking about the traditional business in supply chain. We're here talking about something that really affected, people died, and people are still dying today. I don't know if you remember some images, I don't know if you got access to that, about gold mining in indigenous territory now, and the government is ruling to take away protection of those territories. So we're talking about 600 kilometers of virgin river being exploited for gold mining. So it's just massive, the disruption that we're looking in the country if we take this specific filter of indigenous communities, but it affected everyone and deeply.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Dav. And if we had, I wish we had another hour on here to talk more about all of these topics because there's a lot to dive into. One thing I heard from all of you was sort of the fact that this pandemic either emphasized the need for accelerated transformation or highlighted or exposed existing vulnerabilities or challenges, sort of exposed challenges in the national context in which you're working. So I want to shift us a little bit now to think about what needs to happen to scale and rebuild, scale solutions and rebuild blue and green economies that you all are working with. So to start with this section of questions, Diego, I'll look at you and ask you, through Future of Fish's work with the artisanal and local hake fishing sector in Chile, what solutions have you seen that have the highest potential or priority for strengthening and rebuilding a sustainable local fishing sector?
That's the million-dollar question. I'd say, yeah, for sure, there's no silver bullet. but I'd say that markets and especially consumers have a huge role to play here. So I would divide this like in a couple of main things, which is actually our approach, and that's why I believe in them as well. And because I believe in them, I will overlap with the approach of the organization, which has to do with the supply chains and with the co-design and building capacity within the communities, right? So first, I'd say, yeah, build the capacity, right? With the fishers, the associative, administrative, operational, business capacity, those things. It's not easy in a country and communities that work in very individualistic logics and that operate like in trade and everything super individualistically. Second, to be able to coordinate with other players. Like, of course, we cannot, as a small NGO, do this alone, nor fishers. We need the collaboration between fishers, between fishing communities, but also to incorporate the government through traceability and enforcement, supply chains, consumers, sellers, etc., other NGOs, responsible businesses, even the academic sector. And be able also to seek some global expertise, comparable countries, comparable experiences. Third, I'd say, and as I was briefly suggesting before, to be able to generate a differentiated market is key. With new players, be able to stimulate a responsible ecosystem. There is a lot of interest in Chile and most of the world, of course, we're some years behind culturally in this regard from the US about the demand for responsibly sourced products. It's definitely growing fast in Chile, but there's very little knowledge about the complicated situation of fisheries, particularly here in the country, where today more than half of them are considered overexploited or collapsed. And also small-scale fishers, which are a particularly vulnerable sector in the country. And the fourth and last thing, I'd say the inclusion of technology for the creation of differentiated markets and this, to be able to communicate and connect like responsible consumers with responsible producers. You need traceability, you need data, you need information in general. But that's not easy to implement. So this, I think, are four of the main issues that we've seen, but there are multiple challenges, and in each one of these four things that I was describing, we experienced a lot of challenges, and we've been designing, co-designing, piloting, and then iterating a lot. You know? For example, in one of our many iterations, and after some time working with the fishers, enabling trade, you know, putting them together with buyers or open-air vendors and everything, we decided to create our own responsible intermediary, not-for-profit business, because it was the only way where we could make sure that like the process, like that we could guarantee that the good practices were being kept from the boat, you know, to the final consumer in terms of traceability, in terms of quality, in terms of the sanitary conditions for the processed fish, etc. So we created this little organization called Micaleta, like My Cove, who acts a little bit as a for piloting, you know, as a pioneer on this new responsible small-scale supply. So yeah, but it's definitely not easy to be competitive there. If you're trying to be super responsible, you know, and comply with all regulations and have to, you know, do your invoices and pay your VATs, you know, and everything, you are less competitive than the rest. So it's not easy for sure. But there's, as I was saying before, a growing group of people who are willing and more interested to pay maybe a little bit extra for this type of product, right? Yeah. So yeah, a lot of great experiences, a lot of adaptations and learning processes, and yeah, there's still a lot of challenges out there to be able, especially to replicate and scale these solutions. You know.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that, Diego. And this point on you know, the challenges of transitioning to more responsible, sustainable supply chains is one that you know, ties well into my next question for you, Dav, which is, earthworms work in engaging brands and companies across supply chains, of course, is critical for scaling regenerative practices, but also has its own challenges. From your perspective, what is needed to accelerate and transform the way these agriculture supply chains and companies that the earthworm is working with, and transform them to promote and incentivize regenerative practices?
I'll take on what Diego positioned around the scale, and I will put also here elements around kinetic, because we're not transitioning from ground zero and accelerating the transition. Remember, degradation is still going on, and it's going much faster than regeneration. So to give you this example, we are working on model of 40,000 hectares of regenerative agriculture in agroforestry. This is just massive. There is, I don't know, similar project on agroforestry in size, 40,000 hectares. But that's just the deforestation of 1 month in Amazon. And we're planning for 10 years, and that is the result of degradation of 1 month. So that's something that is need on the table to put to the brands, to put to the traders, to put to the finance system to understand these ideas of kinetics. Much of the time we are a bit romantic when we think about transition, like, oh, we're going to do the transition and after it will be perfect, it will be beautiful. It will be painful to do the transition. It will be expensive. But we have no choice. Just as clear as that. If we look to the numbers, it's just clear. We have no choice. And if we deny the facts, then we are just under the laws of nature. And you can invite Darwin to give you the speech here to explain what happened under the laws of nature, okay? That point of kinetics is fundamental to do the transition. There is a huge need of investment for this new way of thinking agriculture. The competencies of technical assistance, the way we care of the soil, the way we select the seeds and we combine seeds, the way we design supply chains and connect, and going to Ninke, connect that to landscapes. Because even when we think about landscapes, most of brands, they will say, okay, oh, I source cocoa from a landscape, boom. And that landscape become cocoa landscape. But it's not, the landscape is a rich place with a lot of production, with complexity. And you cannot have this kind of design of extractive of one kind of thing from a landscape that is large, that is complex, that can produce a lot of things. So these kind of business arrangement, they are happening somehow. You have dialogue, a weird dialogue, interesting dialogue into the supply chain, this macro ecosystem, to build those arrangements and then give incentives to the transition. Although here, incentives, we need to really improve the inclusiveness of those incentives. Today, most of the incentives, they are talking to those that can be in the table. So you say carbon, for example, as a mean of incentivized transition, but who can be part of that kind of negotiation? They are not the excluded communities. They are not the little farmers. They are those that can play the game, the real game. So a lot of lawyers, a lot of cost to be in the carbon conversation. We need to democratize the process of incentive to gain speed, and to gain speed to have consistence on the technical assistance to do that. And that goes from seedling, and that's a huge challenge to regenerate. We don't have enough greenhouses to supply the demand for regeneration. If you take the same conversation on fertilizers crisis, we urgently need to find out other sources, not to put chemical on the soil, but to grow fertility on the soil with a natural approach. And guess what? We almost don't know about that. We don't know how to do that. Of course, we know how to do that, small scale, with a kind of people like the permaculture thinkers, they think that on this, but major scale for soy industry or for palm industry or for cotton industry. So if we talk about regeneration at farm level, landscape level, we need to understand industrial regeneration and capital regeneration. So the supply chain can work integrated to the real transition. And on that note, it's really important what is happening now with the Green Deal, both in US and both in Europe, because it's setting the pace of this massive transition. Humanity never ever done that. It's the first time that as living organisms, humans will do such adventure, that is regenerate at the planetary level what we've been destroying. And for me, the question remains, do we have enough consistency on our wording to put that into action for real? That's the window of time we have. We have about 10 years. And actually, I have my own doubt if we don't pass the tipping point. But let's be hopeful that we have this window to change the reality. But it's now or never. I mean, it's really clear.
Yeah. Thanks, Dav. And one of the pieces you mentioned is this need for scaling and capital regeneration, and it's a good link into, Ninka, the question for you, which is, we know finance will be critical for really accelerating any of these changes or transformations, and we've also seen in the last few years increased interest in finance for nature-based solutions, and I'm wondering what you see as needed to ensure that finance and investment into whether they're nature-based solutions or regenerative solutions actually have an impact on the ground, and make an impact in the communities and supply chains in which you work. And if you can answer in 3 or 4 minutes, I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, I'll try my best, Ethan, because that's a pretty big question, right?
Yeah.
But I thought the remark of Dov saying, well, ground zero is not even where we start, because deforestation, degradation are still in full swing and happening is an important one. And it dovetails a bit this remark on climate change and what is still ahead of us. It dovetails a bit with the earlier discussion that we had around COVID and disruption in systems. So I think maybe we all remember these cartoons or these images that were going around on WhatsApp and other media saying, well, now there's COVID, but next is going to be climate change, and it's going to be the next big thing that's going to disrupt our the way we live and the way we eat, and maybe in a good way, the way we treat each other. But you're right, finance will be critical, and action needs to be accelerated to come to transformation on supply chains, in the food system, in meeting the Paris goals. And of course, major new commitments were again made in Paris, many of them related to forests and related to land governance and impacts of land-based emissions. So yeah, you're right, there's interest and there's even a lot of capital now available, but the big question is, can it be deployed to meet these purposes, and are these investors ready to rise to this challenge of enabling this land use transition? And I think we can all recognize that will not be an easy journey. It's not a paved road. It could even be a road that is characterized by the same type of poor infrastructure that we were just earlier on referencing for the context of Liberia, which I think maybe Ethan you've experienced yourself. Yeah. So what are challenges, or a couple of things that, at least in my work, trying to enable investment in sustainable landscape, I run into? Maybe 5 that I'd like to highlight. First, there is a lack of project developers. So who are these strong, accountable companies with deep sustainability commitments on the ground that can develop projects and that can absorb big amounts of capital? And of course, provide assurances that these amounts of capital will be repaid to investors. So a lack of these type of project developers is still something that many are struggling with. Second, bankable agricultural business models. I think in the conversation, we talk about regenerative agriculture, we talk about food security, we talk about income diversification, but most of the agricultural investment models are still very single commodity focused. So a lot of learning needs to happen on diversified agricultural systems, both on the production side and the agronomy, as Dov highlighted, but also on the investor side of the table. You can no longer assess a farm only on its timber harvest production model. It needs to be diversified. You need to consider multiple crops. And that, of course, makes investments also more complex. Then finally, or maybe third, we have this landscape approach. So land caters to many different needs. It can not only be that land is used, as was mentioned, for production of cocoa, or land is used to plant trees to absorb carbon. Land serves many people's needs, nature's needs, biodiversity needs. So these type of investments need to be designed in a much more holistic way. Then there's of course also the question of land rights and land governance. So nature-based solutions need to be designed in such a way that they're designed in an inclusive manner, taking the needs and habits and traditions of people that inhabit those lands into account. So that also makes it difficult to design these type of investment projects. That takes a long time, and those are costs that are difficult for the private sector to absorb. And then finally, there's of course this question of bankability versus inclusive investment. There are a lot of rural livelihoods. There's a lot of smallholder production systems that are affected by climate change that are really in need of support in transitioning to more resilient ways of doing their agriculture, of transitioning towards a living income. But these people are often not the most bankable ones. So how can the capital that is currently being allocated reach these smallholders? And I think also there is still a lot that we need to learn about blended finance, not being only private finance, but really being a mix between subsidies and support schemes for these vulnerable groups versus where capital that is privately managed can be deployed and can actually generate revenues, and how that mix is supposed to play out for these different segments of the population. So yeah, so those 5 points, project developers, who's going to develop these big projects, the bankability of the agricultural business models. Do we continue single commodity, or are we all going to embrace and learn for diversified production systems that also cater to food security needs? The landscape approach and footing the bill of convening all these different stakeholders for holistic solutions, land rights and governance, and inclusive development. So taking along smallholders and rural livelihoods are for me the big points that stand out to make the transition just. Yeah, so yeah, maybe to wrap up, if I'm allowed to, 1 more minute, I think I have.
1 more minute.
1 more minute, that's great. Good. So maybe to echo then, Diego, I think you said that we need to replicate, we need to scale solutions, grow the space. And I think I'd really like to echo that. We need to share these experiences. And maybe within the work of my team, managing these technical assistance facilities for sustainable land management investment funds. Yeah, that I really experienced that a lot of support, grants, convening is needed to really build investable propositions that tick all of these boxes. And then maybe as a highlight for me, one of the things that we've been that I'm seeing and that I'm inspired by is innovative business models that pool land resources of smallholders and communities to attract investment into those. So one example there is our cassava block farming model in Nigeria, a group of farmers coming together and then attracting capital to do more sustainable agricultural practices and increase yields around cassava, are similar models that we are aiming to pilot in Liberia, with communities owning land and then setting up a joint venture together with an investment company, but on their own land, on their own terms, to replant previously degraded and deforested land with agroforestry. So I think these type of inclusive investment models are really new developments that yeah, I can hope we get many more of in the future.
Very good. Thanks, Nika. I'm going to do a quick time check for all of us. We're at 41 after the hour, at 45, 1:45 Eastern, 10:45 Pacific, 45 wherever you are. We are going to go to audience questions and answers. So we have about 4 minutes, and I want to use those 4 minutes to invite one of our panelists to ask a question of your fellow panelists, and we can discuss and answer one question from one of you in the last 4 minutes, and then we'll move to some audience questions. So I want to open it for any of you three. If something that someone else said was inspiring or ticked a nerve, you know, feel free to follow up.
I'd like to ask to Ninke something. Have you experimented in your context of Liberia a more regional engagement around knowledge sharing, country to country, for regenerative strategies? Or do you believe that the countries are still just in the beginning of the journey, figuring out how to solve that within their own framework?
Oh, that's a good one, Dov. And maybe also to clarify, we do have a very strong team in Liberia, but unfortunately they were all in the field. So I sort of stepped in and am speaking on their behalf, not being Liberian and all that. But yeah, I hope that that's acceptable considering that they were not able to call in today. I think that the question that you're asking suggests that there is a master plan and somebody holding the strings on planning a transition and trying to predict the road ahead and put the right building blocks into place. I wonder to what extent that is the national government in relationships with others. I see individuals or organizations that try to pioneer and master this agenda. And I do think that they look beyond the borders and they try to mobilize knowledge from elsewhere. But in terms of a planned, thought-through approach that is inspired by neighboring countries, that I'm not. I don't think that that's fully there. But then, if I have the opportunity, maybe bouncing that question back to you. So, do you think that there's particular opportunity there or a need for countries to learn more from each other?
Absolutely. I miss a bit on this field of development, the South cooperation. I think that by the past or in other agendas like educational agendas or other development issues, it's more active and established than in regeneration. I will say perhaps in Amazon biome, there is a bit of trans-country exchanges that had been more effective by the past. Now is a bit like split, essentially due to the positioning of Brazil that is weird at the table with some weird agendas. So it's hard to establish a concrete panorama for negotiation of commitments. But I know that in Africa also there are some cross-pollination country to country. I can't tell the extent of that, but something really important to establish because biomes don't know borders or the atmosphere is the same. And it's really important to establish this longer term planning and funding for the transition. I believe that's one of the key questions to clarify how we fund that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Don. So with the time that we have left, I'm going to turn it over to audience questions. And as a reminder for everyone who's participating, you can submit questions in the Whova app in the Q&A section, and we'll bring them up. So this first one, I'll hand it to you, Diego, first. I saw you went off mute a second ago, and give you a chance to answer this. This question is, In the past year, we have been hearing a lot about the concept of building back better. In the various countries where each of you work, and Diego, starting in Chile, it sounds like the pandemic has highlighted existing vulnerabilities, for instance, in terms of in-country infrastructure or supply chains. Therefore, what would building back better look like in Chile, and what enabling conditions would first be needed to build back better?
Another big question. I mean, there's so many areas of opportunity, but in terms of energy, for sure, in terms of like recovery of soil, you know, but I'm not an expert on those, so I'm gonna stick to what I know most. I think that, well, first of all, like to be able to have strong regulation is key, right? And in Chile, I think that we do in general. We have like a pretty modern one. The problem is that we don't have enough budget to enforce, and people, depending on the sector and everything, will or will not comply, and it depends also on the political will. I mean, you know, like the law seems great, but then, you know, there's lack of political will and those type of things. And of course, it's understandable. Like I was gonna ask Dov earlier when I opened the microphone, a related question, which is, you know, Brazil made like a pretty interesting commitment in the last conference of the parties about like stopping illegal deforestation by 2028. But that's not an easy thing to do, for sure. I mean, I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of like you know, social issues with that, and I wonder about like the real like political will or coordination to be able to implement such a policy, especially in countries like the whole world, you know, like coming out of like economic complicated times, you know? And of course, I mean, the opportunities are growing all the time about like new, like more sustainable, you know, options and alternatives and everything, but especially for developing countries, that requires, you know, some like important investment. You know, there's a gap to be like overcome there, and so yeah, it's complicated for sure. It's not an easy thing to run governments and to recover from a pandemic. Of course, if we, you know, as Dov was saying earlier as well, I mean, like the window of opportunity is like closing and closing if it's not already closed, you know. So whatever consideration for the future, like that's the most important thing to have in mind, you know. Like we won't have a future if we like keep delaying these hard decisions and important transitions. But yeah, I'm connected to another thing that I was saying before, which I think has driven a lot of changes in different supply chains, not only in the fishing sector but in other areas as well. Is consumer awareness and the demand from consumers. I mean, I had the luck to work in some things where like there were some super shady and complicated situations with like very long supply chains connecting different parts of the world, and the consumers in one part like started like demanding all the supply chain from behind, and that actually triggered like regulation change in some other countries, you know, developing countries and everything. So that's yeah, whether we like it or not, markets today, like you know, are like tend to mark the pace of the conversations and everything. So if we can like connect that with like the increased awareness and concern of consumers globally for like more responsible practices and making like shedding light over like supply chains and everything, that's definitely like a key part of it.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. We have a few more questions coming in, so I want to jump to another one. This is for you, Nika, which is, given that the big sources of capital are private funds and multilaterals, for example, the development banks, World Bank, etc., where are they in prioritizing regenerative projects directly and through their nationally owned or commercial bank channels. Is there a need for a new global entity to aggregate regenerative project finance? Where do you see sort of project finance for regenerative projects coming from?
I think regenerative agriculture is taking it a step further, right? So we have sustainable agriculture, and then regenerative is probably like even more sustainable because it can sustain itself into the future without ends. I think that's sort of the definition most people are referring to. There are a couple of questions in that. What I think is needed in terms of a transition is that we move a lot of the existing financial institutions along, and also start to tighten up more and more investment requirements around to the extent to which an agricultural investment needs to be green. And I think in that light, it was really encouraging today, at least in Europe, to see that the green taxonomy has now passed the European legislation. So that is now providing a very clear indication on what is a green investment, both in the energy side as well as in the land use space. And you can still maybe to some extent argue, well, that's not fully regenerative, but I think just having this taxonomy and having clear definitions will really support in moving the needle, both on public investment as well as on the private investment side. On the question of setting up a dedicated vehicle, I think personally for me that would not be a preferred route. I think we need to move the whole sector along, and also that regenerative agriculture is quite a diverse term, and it can work out very diversely in different places. So it probably also requires a lot of different actors getting into the space and starting to pioneer.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that, Inka. So our last question here, just based on timing, will be Dag for you. Let me pull it up here. For global commodity supply chains, who should pay to internalize negative externalities? Should the consumers pay the premium? And what is the shared responsibility of actors along the supply chain? That's also a big question, but yeah, I want to get your initial thoughts now.
But I will say, yes, the consumer for sure need to be engaged, and something that I all the time provoke on the conversation I have is how we get engaged the consumer to have a better informed choices. Because most of the consumer, they are in automatic mode. So we buy stuff at the supermarket, but we don't know exactly what we're buying. But if we get the choice to have a little bit more information about what product is that exactly, eventually myself, I can take a better choice. So in all cases, there is a need to engage the end of the supply chain, that is the consumer. But the point is, if the consumer pays a premium, is how this premium reach the ground, because it can stay in the middle. Okay, now the consumer paid a premium. There's a premium for the CEO. It is fantastic. That's how the capitalisms work, right? Isn't it? Because the premium, again, is an incentive to fund the transition that is super expensive. Right? It's not an easy thing to transition a model that have been the monoculture model for 70 years. We design all the stuff around this idea of industrialization of agriculture. And suddenly now we need to mimic life. It's not something easy to do. It's something that will take a lot of thinking, a lot of new practices, a lot of new engines, a lot of new know-how, etc. And to finance that, of course, premium for a responsible product is a must. And still a challenge. Most of the time, brands are knocking the door to the farmer and say, okay, I buy you if it's responsible. And the producer will say, okay, you pay more. No, I don't pay more. I pay the same. And that's one of the gaps to build the transformation, the regeneration. Therefore, who is in a position of power is again the consumer. Because if the consumer demands more, if the consumer is willing to have a little bit more on the bill to secure that the product that he is buying or she is buying is regenerating life in the planet, who's going to say no if it's affordable, right? And then how to engage the marketers of the brands to really be playful with consumer, to gamify regeneration, to not make a kind of big monster of regeneration, etc. There's a lot of good cases of brands that took a little bit more courage, shifting around their positioning and listening more to their consumers. And when brands do that, they have a very nice feedback from the consumers, that the consumers will say, okay, we're willing to maintain our relationship with the brand we like, but we want the brand to be part of this narrative.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dav. And I see we're getting close on time here, so want to just thank the other participants who submitted questions. We wish we could get to all of them, but are running out of time here. So want to just wrap up, take a minute here to reflect on what we've talked about. First off, I want to thank our panelists for a great discussion. We got to learn more about IDH's experience in Liberia and globally, Future of Fish's work in Chile, and Earthworm Foundation's work in Brazil. Some of the key takeaways and threads that I took from this conversation is that this transition needs to happen because degradation is still happening at the same pace. And actually, to make this transition, it's every sector. It's the financial sector. It's consumers. It's bringing technology in, to artisanal fishing, and it's diversification is a critical need in this transformation as well. And that we need to do things that have never been done, and there's risk, and it needs political will. It needs finance. It needs enabling conditions to make sure that this transition can be supported. There's lots of other good threads in here, the need for inclusivity and in bringing projects to the ground and implementing, as well as engagement with the multitude of stakeholders who are involved in multifaceted landscapes that are outside of any one individual commodity. So those are just a couple reflections that I have. I want to thank you all again for the time. I'm going to kick it over to Ryan to close us here in the last minute. But again, thanks everyone for participating.